It was supposed to be just another quiet night in this peaceful town, a place where nothing truly unexpected ever happened. Families were asleep in their beds, unaware of the tragedy that was about to unfold. But at exactly 1 a.m., the police received a frantic call. A woman, Sarah Carter, was in distress, sobbing, struggling to form words. A robbery, she claimed. A violent break-in that ended in bloodshed. Her husband, Mark Carter, was dead. The police arrived at the scene within minutes. The house, once a warm and welcoming home, now felt like something else entirely, a crime scene. Officers rushed inside, weapons drawn, scanning every corner for signs of danger. But there were no intruders, no movement. Just Sarah, trembling in the living room, her blood-stained hands gripping a phone. Her daughter, Emily Carter, sat frozen on the couch, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. The silence in the house was deafening, save for the occasional choked sob escaping Sarah's lips. Mark's body lay in the hallway near the front door. A pool of blood stained the hardwood floor beneath him. A single bullet wound to the chest, clean, precise, deadly. The glass of a shattered vase lay scattered nearby, as if there had been a struggle. The drawers in the living room were pulled open, jewelry boxes emptied onto the floor. A forced entry. A robbery turned violent. At least, that's how it appeared. Sarah's voice was unsteady as she explained what had happened. She told the officers about the masked men, how they had burst into their home demanding money and valuables. How Mark had tried to stop them, how he had fought to protect his family, and how, in the chaos, one of them pulled the trigger. The officers listened carefully, their expressions unreadable as they took notes. Sarah kept repeating herself, almost as if she needed to convince herself of her own words. "They killed him, they just shot him, he was trying to protect us." The words came out in a whisper, barely audible, as fresh tears ran down her face. Emily, however, remained silent. She hadn't spoken a word since the police arrived. She sat motionless, her hands gripping her knees tightly. An officer crouched down beside her, speaking softly, asking if she was hurt. Emily only shook her head. Her mother wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. But even then, Emily didn't react. The forensic team arrived shortly after. They moved swiftly through the house, snapping photos, collecting evidence, scanning for fingerprints. A medical examiner confirmed what was already obvious: Mark had died almost instantly. There were no other injuries on his body, no signs of prolonged struggle. Just that one fatal shot. Neighbors stood outside, murmuring amongst themselves, watching as the crime scene unfolded. Some spoke to officers, recounting how they had been woken up by the sirens. None of them had heard the gunshot, though. Perhaps the sound had been muffled. Perhaps they had simply slept through it. Or perhaps, they had been meant to hear nothing at all. Sarah was taken to the station for further questioning, as was standard procedure in cases like this. She sat in the interrogation room, her hands wrapped around a cup of untouched coffee. She looked exhausted. Broken. She answered every question the officers asked, repeating her story over and over. They came out of nowhere, they had guns, they wanted money. Mark tried to stop them, the words never changed. The details never wavered. And yet, something about it all felt rehearsed. The hours dragged on. Emily had been taken to a separate room, where a female officer gently spoke to her, trying to get her to talk. But she remained quiet, offering only the occasional nod or shake of her head. The shock had taken over. Or perhaps, there was something else weighing her down. Something she couldn't yet put into words. By sunrise, the police released Sarah and Emily, allowing them to return home. Mark's body had been removed, but the bloodstains remained, an unshakable reminder of what had happened. Sarah walked through the house, staring at the mess left behind, the shattered vase, the upturned furniture, the open drawers. She sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. Her daughter sat beside her but said nothing. The town mourned Mark Carter. The funeral was held 2 days later, with dozens of people in attendance. Friends, family, neighbors, people who had known Mark as a kind, hard-working man. They came to pay their respects, to offer their condolences to Sarah and Emily. Sarah stood at the front, accepting the words of sympathy with a hollow nod. Emily remained close by, her expression unreadable. But behind closed doors, behind the tears and the grief, something lingered. Something unsaid. The truth had yet to surface. And the questions were only just beginning. If you're enjoying the story so far, make sure to like the video, it really helps us bring more thrilling stories to you. The aftermath of Mark Carter's death seemed to hang in the air like an unsettling fog. The town mourned his loss, and the community rallied behind Sarah and Emily. But for the police, something felt off. In the days following the murder, Detective Anderson couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the story Sarah had told them just didn't add up. There was something about the scene, the way she'd retold the events, that made him question the truth. It wasn't just the details, it was the way she repeated them, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as the officers. At first, they chalked it up to grief. It was only natural for her to be in shock. But the nagging doubts in Anderson's mind refused to fade. He instructed his team to go over the security footage from the neighborhood, just to be thorough. It was a long shot, but they had to be certain. The footage came in, grainy and blurred. The timestamp confirmed the break-in happened just before 1 a.m., right around the time Sarah had described. But as Anderson reviewed the footage frame by frame, something caught his eye: a car, parked suspiciously outside the Carter home minutes before the robbers had arrived. A black sedan, its headlights off. No one had mentioned it. No one had seen it. And it was too close to the crime scene to be ignored. He zoomed in on the car's license plate. A quick check with the DMV database yielded results. This wasn't a stolen vehicle, nor was it registered to any known criminals. The car belonged to a local man named Greg Mallory, a small-time hustler with a shady reputation. Anderson's instincts told him this was no coincidence. Later that day, Mallory was picked up for questioning. His alibi was weak. He claimed he had been home, but no one could corroborate it. He was sweating. His hands shook. Anderson knew this was the break they had been waiting for. After hours of grilling, Mallory cracked. He spilled everything. It wasn't a robbery, he admitted. It wasn't even a heist gone wrong. What had happened in that house was far darker. A planned execution. A contract killing. The wife wanted him dead, Mallory confessed, his voice low and reluctant. She paid us to do it. Told us exactly how to stage the robbery. The whole thing was a setup. Sarah's face flashed in Anderson's mind. He had suspected it all along, but to hear it confirmed from one of the perpetrators was another thing entirely. The pieces began to fit together. Why? Why would she want her husband dead? Anderson demanded. She said he was a monster, Mallory muttered, his eyes darting nervously. She said he'd done something to her daughter. Something unforgivable. She wanted revenge. She wanted him gone. The confession sent shockwaves through the department. What had Sarah Carter discovered about her husband that would make her want to go this far? The questions only multiplied. And now, they had a suspect, a wife, who appeared to be the grieving widow, but was actually the mastermind behind her husband's murder. With Mallory's confession in hand, the police arrested the other members of the gang. All of them pointed the finger back at Sarah. They had been paid to carry out a job, and they did it with the precision of hired killers. It wasn't a random act of violence. It was cold, calculated, and, worst of all, planned by the one person who should have been the most devastated by Mark's death. The arrest was made quietly, but the implications were anything but subtle. Sarah Carter, once the beloved wife of the town's golden boy, was now under suspicion for the murder of her own husband. Later that afternoon, Sarah was summoned for another round of questioning. She walked into the interrogation room with the same exhausted demeanor she had shown before, her face pale and drawn from the constant strain. She seemed to have no idea what was coming, no inkling that the web of lies she had spun was unraveling before her eyes. "Sarah," Detective Anderson began, his voice calm but firm, "we need to talk about the murder of your husband, Mark." Her eyes flickered with a brief flash of confusion, then hardened with the usual sorrow. "What more is there to say?" "I told you everything," she replied, her voice cracking slightly, though she quickly composed herself. "You told us a story about a robbery gone wrong," Anderson continued, "but the facts don't add up. The security footage from a neighbor's house shows a car parked outside your home just minutes before the break-in. It was registered to a man named Greg Mallory. Mallory, along with his associates, has confessed to being hired by you to murder your husband." Sarah's lips trembled. Her eyes darted to the floor as she processed the words, but she didn't deny them. She didn't scream. She didn't protest. "I didn't kill him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't. I couldn't." But there was no conviction in her words. No defiance. Only the hollow sound of a woman slowly realizing that everything she had worked so hard to hide was coming to light. "Then why did you hire them?" Anderson pressed. "Why would you do such a thing?" Her head hung low as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because he wasn't the man you all thought he was." She paused, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. "He hurt my daughter. He abused her." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Anderson could see the anguish in her eyes, the guilt that bled through her pain. She had been protecting her daughter, or so she thought. She had been willing to go to any lengths to protect Emily from a man she once called her husband. But even as Sarah confessed, Anderson could see the cracks in her story. There was something more, something dark and twisted, that still hadn't been revealed. What was the full extent of the secret Sarah was hiding? What had truly happened behind closed doors? "You killed him," Anderson said, his voice softening for the first time. "But why the staged robbery? Why go to all that trouble?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, her face crumpling as the weight of her actions caught up with her. "Because I didn't want anyone to know. I didn't want Emily to live with the shame." Her confession hung in the air like a dark cloud, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. The detectives had their work cut out for them now, and the answers were still far from clear. The real story, her story, was only beginning to come out. The interrogation room was sterile, cold, and unyielding. Detective Anderson sat across from Sarah Carter, his pen poised over his notepad. They had already gone through the events of the night, but there was one thing still nagging at him. What had truly led Sarah to take her husband's life? Was it just the years of abuse, or was there something deeper? Something that had pushed her to the edge? Sarah sat motionless, her hands clenched in her lap. Her face, once pale with grief, was now drawn and weary. The time had come for her to finally speak the truth, the whole truth. After days of denial and half-truths, it was time to confront the deepest horror she had uncovered. With a shaky breath, Sarah began to speak. 2 weeks before Mark's death, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I found something. Something I never thought I would see." Detective Anderson leaned forward, sensing that she was about to reveal something significant. "What did you find, Sarah?" he asked, his voice calm, almost coaxing. Sarah's hands trembled as she wiped her eyes, staring at the table in front of her. "I found his phone," she continued, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean to go through it, but I was looking for something. I thought it would be a picture of us, something happy. But instead, I found videos. Videos of Emily. My daughter." The words hung in the air like a poison, the weight of them settling heavily between them. Detective Anderson's pen paused, the sharp click of it tapping against his pad the only sound in the room. He had suspected something darker was at play, but hearing it from Sarah's lips was another matter entirely. "What were the videos of?" Anderson asked softly. He'd been recording her," Sarah whispered, unable to hold back her tears. "He'd been secretly filming Emily in the bathroom. While she was getting changed, or showering, he'd record her, and then send those videos to his friends." Detective Anderson felt the bile rise in his throat. He'd heard of twisted cases before, but this was something unfathomable. He could see it in Sarah's face, the horror of what she had uncovered. But there was more. There always was. "How did you feel when you found them?" Anderson asked, trying to make sense of her emotions. Sarah's hands tightened around each other, her fingers white as she clutched them tightly. "I felt sick. I couldn't breathe. I thought I was going to pass out when I saw it. My husband, the man I trusted, he was a monster. He wasn't the man I thought he was." "What did you do when you saw the videos?" Anderson pressed, wanting to know how far Sarah had gone before the murder. Sarah paused, her eyes staring at the table as if she were reliving the moment. "I wanted to confront him. I wanted to tell him that I knew. I thought about taking the phone to the police. But I couldn't. I was scared. Scared of what he'd do to Emily if I did. I was scared that he'd kill her or ruin her life even more." The guilt in Sarah's eyes was palpable. Detective Anderson could feel the weight of her words, the fear that had kept her silent, the terror of her daughter's life being in the hands of a man like Mark. "So, you kept quiet. You didn't tell anyone," Anderson said, his voice quiet, understanding. "But you knew you couldn't let it go on. You knew you couldn't let him get away with it." Sarah nodded, her face pale. I couldn't let him destroy Emily. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't do something." She closed her eyes, fighting the overwhelming emotions that surged within her. "But I didn't know what to do. I was stuck. I couldn't tell anyone, and I couldn't let him continue." "And that's when you decided to act," Anderson said, not as an accusation, but as an understanding. Sarah's eyes flickered to his, a moment of connection in the sea of darkness. "I thought I could make it stop. That's when I started thinking about what I could do. But the truth is, I never imagined it would end the way it did," Sarah confessed, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to kill him. But when I saw what he was doing to Emily, I lost it. I didn't know how to make it stop any other way." The room fell silent. Sarah's confession wasn't a relief, it didn't bring the comfort of closure. Instead, it left a trail of questions that no one, least of all Sarah, could answer. Was she justified? Could a mother's love be enough to erase the act of murder? The lines between right and wrong blurred in ways that were impossible to reconcile. "I don't know if I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, almost to herself. "I don't know if I regret it. I just knew I had to do something. He was ruining my daughter's life. I couldn't let him do it anymore." Detective Anderson sat back, feeling the full weight of her words. It wasn't the simple confession of a killer, it was the desperate cry of a mother who had reached the breaking point. He didn't know if justice could ever truly be served in this case. Was Sarah guilty of murder, or was she a woman who had done the unthinkable to protect the one thing she loved most in the world? "You did what you thought was necessary," Anderson said quietly. "But now you'll have to live with the consequences. And so will your daughter." Sarah's face crumpled, and her tears flowed freely now. "I couldn't protect her any other way. I just wanted it to stop." The room felt cold, as though the weight of the confession had sucked all warmth from the air. Sarah had revealed the truth, but it wasn't the resolution anyone had hoped for. It was just the beginning of something much darker, a journey of guilt, regret, and irreversible decisions. It had been months of planning, months of living in constant fear and resentment. Sarah had been biding her time, waiting for the right moment, the right plan. Her desperation for peace, for protection, had led her down a dark path. The whispers of an idea came to her one night, as she lay awake next to her husband, listening to his labored breathing in the darkness. A simple robbery. A tragedy no one would question. It started small, like any plan does. She reached out to a group of men she knew, criminals who were desperate enough to do anything for money, but not so dangerous that they would raise suspicion. She didn't want violence, not at first. She just needed them to stage a robbery. A few stolen items, some broken glass, chaos to cover up the real reason behind it all. She promised them a cut of whatever they took, and they agreed. The plan was simple: rob the house, create fear, and then, take him out. Sarah knew what she had to do. She had been preparing for months. Mark was volatile, unpredictable, and there was only so much time left before he went too far. She could see it in his eyes. He was going to hurt Emily, just like he had hurt her. But Sarah wasn't going to let that happen. She would make sure of it. The night arrived. It was like any other, except Sarah's nerves were taut, every muscle in her body coiled with tension. She kissed Emily goodnight, assuring her everything was fine, even though Sarah knew she would never be able to protect her from what was about to happen. She couldn't. Not anymore. At exactly 1 a.m., the plan was set into motion. The robbers broke in, as they had agreed. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the house, and Mark sprang out of bed, groggy with sleep. "What the hell is going on?" he yelled, stumbling toward the noise. Sarah held her breath as the criminals waved their guns, shouting for him to stay down, demanding money and valuables. Mark, as expected, didn't back down. He never did. He lunged at one of the robbers, his fists flailing in a drunken rage. That was the moment Sarah had been waiting for. The moment when chaos would reign and he would become the threat he had always been. The robbers followed through with their part, firing a shot straight into his chest. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, but Sarah barely flinched. She had expected it. The plan was flawless. Mark would die, and she would mourn him publicly. It was the perfect crime, a robbery gone wrong. No one would ever suspect the grieving wife. But then, a terrible realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Mark wasn't dead. His body was crumpled on the floor, the blood pooling beneath him, but his chest still rose and fell, shallow gasps for air. Sarah's heart pounded in her ears as she watched him struggle, unable to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to be dead. He was supposed to be gone. Her chance at freedom, at peace, was supposed to be sealed. She rushed to his side, but it wasn't out of concern. It wasn't the concern of a wife or even a human being watching another suffer. No. It was fear. Fear that her plan had failed, that the nightmare she had created would now come crashing down around her. Mark's bloodshot eyes flickered open as he reached out for her, his hand shaking, clawing at the air in a desperate plea for help that would never come. He choked on his own blood, gasping for breath as he struggled to form words that Sarah couldn't bear to hear. And then, in that one final, horrific moment, Mark's mouth gaped open in an agonizing scream, as though begging for mercy, mercy that would never come. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the pillow beside him, the same pillow that had comforted him so many nights. And in that moment, as Mark's blood spilled onto the floor beneath them, she made her decision. He wasn't going to die in the way she had planned. He wouldn't escape the punishment he deserved. Not like this. With a swift, practiced motion, Sarah pressed the pillow to his face, smothering him. The frantic movement of his hands grew weaker, the gurgling sound in his throat finally giving way to silence. The room went still, and for the first time in years, Sarah felt the rush of control, the rush of power she had so desperately craved. And just like that, it was over. Her husband was dead. Sarah pulled the pillow away and stared at his lifeless body. For a moment, everything felt unreal, like it was all a bad dream. But the silence in the room, the stillness that now hung between them, confirmed it. It was real. He was gone. The rest of the plan was a blur. She disposed of the evidence, making sure to remove any trace of her involvement. The robbers had long since fled, leaving her to play the role of the grieving widow. Sarah cried out, desperately calling 911, playing her part flawlessly. She was careful with her words, with her actions. She knew how this needed to look. A robbery gone wrong, an accident, a tragedy no one would question. But deep down, something shifted. Something told her that this was far from over. What she thought was the end, her escape, her freedom, was only the beginning. Sarah had called the police. She had played the grieving widow flawlessly, recounting a tragic story of a violent robbery that had turned deadly. The intruders, masked and armed, had come in the dead of night, demanding money and valuables. Mark had tried to fight back, heroically trying to protect his family, but it was too late. One of the intruders had shot him in cold blood. The police had believed her. They had sympathized with her. The town had mourned alongside her, offering condolences and support. No one suspected the truth. No one suspected Sarah's role in the horrific crime. She was a victim, just like her daughter. But the lie didn't stay hidden forever. The truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully it was buried. The robbers, looking for a way to reduce their sentences, had turned on her. Their confessions, each one describing how Sarah had orchestrated the entire thing, how she had hired them to stage the robbery and kill Mark, shattered everything. The police had gathered their testimonies, the evidence, and the damning messages from Sarah's phone. In the face of undeniable proof, the truth came to light. Her world had fallen apart in an instant. She had been arrested, charged with the murder of her husband. The loving wife who had once garnered sympathy from her neighbors in the town now stood as a cold-blooded killer in the eyes of the world. The trial was swift. The evidence was overwhelming. Sarah had no choice but to plead guilty, and in the end, the court sentenced her to life in prison. Now, in that stark, lonely cell, Sarah had nothing left. Her daughter, Emily, had left town. Sarah had never been given the chance to explain herself to her. Emily couldn't stay, couldn't live with the memories of what her mother had done. She had packed her belongings in silence, leaving behind the home that had once been full of love, leaving behind the woman who had destroyed their family. As Sarah sat there, staring blankly into the dim light that filtered through the small, barred window, she wondered if she had done the right thing. If she had been justified in her actions. She had killed her husband to protect Emily, to save her from the abuse that had once plagued their lives. Was that wrong? Was that criminal? The world had already decided. Sarah was guilty. She would spend the rest of her life behind bars, paying for a crime she had committed to protect her daughter. The camera lingered on Sarah, her face hollow, her gaze vacant, lost in the weight of her thoughts. She had tried to make the right choice, but in the end, nothing was as simple as it seemed. In the end, the question remained, was Sarah wrong, or was she justified? And if you enjoy crime thriller stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more.